OK, so a damning new opinion piece by Daily Telegraph and GBNews star Alison Pearson says that Britain needs to stop being scared of Islamophobia and start worrying about Anglophobia. So she uses the real-world example of Miriam, a British woman forced for decades to live a cultural double life due to her Muslim father's traditional and repressive views and fear of integration. So Alison writes, I thought of Miriam when I watched George Galloway revel in his victory at the Rochdale by-election. There were no women on the ballot paper, and as far as I could see, there were no female faces among the Muslim brothers at Galloway rallies, apart from George's foxy fourth wife. Islamic patriarchy ruled. Now, her words, of course. And examples of Anglophobia aren't that difficult to find, really. Who remembers the London school forced to surrender to its students who burned a, quote, racist Union Jack flag? And just this week, the Shadow Culture Secretary became the latest to join the Rule Britannia critics.
It's a decision for the people who run the proms. And again, like I said, it shouldn't be politicians who tell people how to run cultural events. I think that for a lot of people, that feels like a very sort of British moment, which I think has to be respected as well. But for a lot of people, it will feel, as J.Q. Mason said, it will feel alienating.
Meanwhile, schools admitted in a recent government report that white working-class pupils are rapidly falling behind other students and are the group that school leaders are now most concerned about. So tonight I'm asking, should we stop being scared of Islamophobia and start worrying more about Anglophobia? Let me know your thoughts, gbviews at gbnews.com, at gbnews on Twitter. While you're there, go and vote in our poll. I'll bring you the results very shortly. But first, going head-to-head on this are the COO of Conservative Friends of the Commonwealth, Sunil Sharma, and human rights activist Aisha Ali-Khan. Both of you, thank you very much. Sunil, I'll start with you. Should we be worrying more about Anglophobia, do you think?
Yes, for sure. I think the threats of Islamophobia have been completely over-exaggerated. I think to the point now where you can't even criticise Islamic extremism without being called Islamophobic. So I think for sure the threats to Anglophobia are far superior than they are for Islamophobia. And this is all backed up by pure statistics. Pure facts, nothing else, just looking at percentages. So we know for a fact that white British students are performing worse off than Muslim-based students. We know their literacy rates are lower. We know their numeracy rates are lower. We know at GCSE level they score lower than pretty much most groups. There's a couple of groups that do, I think Black Caribbeans fall a bit lower, travellers fall a bit lower. But aside from that, white British people in this country, in terms of education-wise, are far falling behind. And I think that's something that we should strongly addressed, considering that is the majority of the population. In particular, it's more of a problem amongst white boys. So we're seeing a much bigger issue with boys, in particular, with education. But on a broader spectrum, I think we need to stop necessarily talking so much about Islamophobia and address the fact that the majority of this country is white and British, and their standards are. So
no, I'll come back to you. Aisha, I'll throw it over to you. Quite a lot to come back to there. Go on.
I think that we can't ignore Islamophobia. We've had like 600% increase since last year, November of last year. I think what we need to, Islamophobic attacks against Muslims in this country. I think what Sunil is highlighting is something that's been chronic in the British educational system. I've been a teacher for nearly 20 years. I have seen myself that of the sort of like the bottom two subgroups, it's white boys, white working class boys, which Sunil just rightly pointed out, but also Pakistanis and Bangladeshi boys. And those two sort of groups have swapped up and down between themselves. I think this idea that we should just ignore Islamophobia and just concentrate on what's going on with Anglophobia is really unfair, and it's wrong. Islamophobia does exist. There's so many examples. I've been a victim of it myself, and lots of insidious different ways as well. I can't just say somebody came up to me and said the P word to me, but there are examples where I've gone into a shop, for example, and my English friend hasn't been followed, but I have, because they think, oh, she's a brown person, she's going to steal something. I think we also need to understand that Alison Pearson's column touched a real nerve for me, with me, because that could have been me. That story about Miriam was my past, is my past. I've grown up with a lot of my friends who went to Pakistan, India and Bangladesh, got married at 15, 16, had families, disappeared from the educational system. I've had friends who've been in abusive marriages, were not able to leave because of cultural expectations. I've had friends who've also had to endure abuse by their own family members, parents, siblings, and then also the in well.
Does that
and
not,
I think,
Aisha, just before I go back to Sunil, with respect, does that not highlight Anglophobia? People not wanting to integrate into British culture, preferring to have more of their own traditional culture, as it were, and forcing that on young British girls?
Well, let me tell you, sorry, I was going to come to the point, Patrick. So much has moved on from the 20, 30 years ago. So much has moved on. Look at myself. I'm an educationalist. I'm a teacher. I went to university. I know family members. They've got degrees as well. Lots and lots of young women are completely shunning the practices of the community. They're traveling, they're deciding to live on their own. They're happy to work, they're happy to support themselves. They do not rely on their husbands, their fathers, their brothers. So we are moving on.
Right.
And this column by Alison is just kind of pointing, is blaming a community that can't defend themselves as easily as, say, other communities as well. So I think it's
okay. I'll come back to you. Sunil, on this, look, we do see, quite regularly stuff now, things apparently being taught to kids in schools that seem to desecrate British culture or show it in a negative light in terms of our history. Pupils burning the Union flag at a school in Pimlico, for example. And arguably as well, some of the things that we see taking place on the streets most Saturdays now, is that Anglophobia, do you think?
Yeah, I think it is. I want to go back on the point about how things have changed on Aisha's point of thing, and they have, and they're getting better for sure. Parts of the Islamic community are definitely integrating more, but there are some cold, hard facts that still exist now. So 70% of Muslim women are unemployed versus 20% of Christian women that are unemployed. We see, to this day, 53% of all British Pakistanis are married to a blood relative. To this day, again, that's not necessarily first cousin, maybe second or third. 37% of all babies born between 2007 and 2011 were subject to British Pakistani parents who were first cousins. We know for a fact when these poor children, babies are born from first cousins, that they have a double the chance of having a birthing defect. So as much as it is changing, it also isn't. And I think that's why Alison's piece is amazing, because it raises awareness that there is a second life to it. There is an opportunity in which here that we can actually address these issues, and we don't have, it's not Islamophobic to say these issues, because there's plenty of people that I would argue in the Islamic community that article will help and get them to speak out and make a difference. So I think her piece is incredible, and it's really important that we're not afraid to say these things. The problem is now, the moment you talk about Anglophobia, the moment you talk about what I've just discussed, the first word people will say to you is, you're being Islamophobic. And I think that's unfair. I think it shuts the discussion down, and it doesn't allow us to talk about what we talked about earlier in terms of people burning down the Union Jack, drawing attention to the fact that white boys at school are struggling and are continuing to struggle. It doesn't highlight the fact that as a country, we're seeing large groups of people refusing to integrate into British society. That's
a good point for us to pass it back over to Aisha, I think. Do you want to come back on that, a kind of refusal to integrate, perhaps?
Let me just remind Sunil that I was talking about cousin marriages 20 years ago. I was actually campaigning against cousin marriages. I was campaigning for more Muslim women to have access to education, to go to college, to be allowed to learn the language of our homeland. Everything that you've mentioned has already been covered, and I'm so happy to say that the younger generation have taken it on board. They've realised, they've seen for themselves, they've seen siblings born with disabilities, they've seen uncles and aunties go through abusive marriages, and they're saying, no, we're not going to do this. I think what I find offensive about Alison's article is that she's taking the community...
Oh, I think we might have lost Aisha, unfortunately. That's a real shame. OK, all right. Well, look, thank you very much. It was about time to wrap anyway, unfortunately, but there we go. CEO of Conservative Friends of the Commonwealth, Sunil Sharma, and human rights activist Aisha Ali-Khan. Certainly a robust debate that, wasn't it? Well, look, who do you agree with? Is Telegraph columnist Alison Pearson right to say that we should stop being scared of Islamophobia, start worrying more about Anglophobia? Joe on X says, youngsters are ashamed to be British now, but if you point that out, you're just called a racist. Anglophobia is a big problem. I think it's that, well, it is, that aspect of whether or not it is shameful to be British. That's certainly one thing that I'm concerned about. Alex on X says, Islamophobia accusations are just thrown around by politicians to avoid dealing with the actual issues. Dave says, no, because Anglophobia doesn't exist. Compared to all the other issues, it's just not a problem. OK, Dave's view then. Like, look, your verdict is in. 81% of you agree that Alison Pearson is right, that we should stop being scared of Islamophobia, start worrying about Anglophobia. 19% of you say she is not correct.